Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's already part 10 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. This time around I only have 5 new cards, but one of those is the new Rogue Death Knight hero card that certainly deserves a lot of discussion, and I have a Druid card that's one of the most ridiculous looking things I think I've ever seen, so there's still going to be a lot of meat to this review. That said, as always, I'll be starting off with some detailed reviews of each of these cards. If you don't have a ton of time and you just want to see the card reviews, there's a link in the description below that'll take you towards the end of the video where I'll be doing quick 1 to 5 star reviews of each of these cards so you can just catch the reveals and get my overall take. But of course, I hope you'll hang out for all my long format thoughts because it's always pretty interesting to think about these cards and theory craft how they're going to be utilized. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into the detailed reviews. So up first is actually the new Rogue Death Knight hero. It's called Valeera the Hollow. It's a new 9-mana card. It gives you 5 armor, like all the Death Knight hero cards so far. And the battle cry reads, gain stealth until your next turn. So before we move on to the hero power and the cards associated with it, I do want to talk about this stealth effect real quickly and what that means. It essentially operates just like minion stealth. If you attack while you're stealthed, you'll cancel your stealth, so you do need to use your weapon before playing Valeera the Hollow. Secondly, you can actually take damage as a stealthed hero with things like, you know, Hunter's Hero Power, Greater Arcane Missiles, basically any damage spells that aren't targeted. This only prevents you from being targeted, so minions can't attack you, fireballs couldn't hit you. So it really does cut out a lot of potential damage, but it's not technically like an ice block that makes you completely immune, which is an important distinction because that could matter from time to time. But you also get this cool new this cool new hero power called Death's Shadow. It's a passive hero power, the first one we've seen so far for these Death Knight cards. And that means during your turn, you automatically get a Shadow Reflection card put into your hand. Now, I don't say added to your hand, because this card essentially only lives in your hand for a given turn. So if you don't use your Shadow Reflection, it gets tossed out of your hand. That has been confirmed by the Blizzard developers. So it's only during that single turn you get to use 1 Shadow Reflection. And as you can probably read ahead, the Shadow Reflection is a card that anytime you play a card from your hand, the Shadow Reflection becomes a reflection of the last card that you played. So say you turn into Valeera, you go into your next turn, you play an Eviscerate. Shadow Reflection instantly becomes another Eviscerate. It's the exact same thing as an Eviscerate. It's a 2-mana Eviscerate, exact copy. But then say you play a Leroy Jenkins, your Shadow Reflection turns into a Leroy Jenkins. So you can't cast your Leroy Jenkins anymore because you've already spent 7 mana. But alternatively, if you play your Leroy Jenkins first, and then you play Eviscerate, then the Shadow Reflection will end up being an Eviscerate, and you can play the second Eviscerate for a total of 9 mana. So essentially, Shadow Reflections kind of has this soft cap where you can't actually play any cards larger than 5 mana without some sort of mana cheating process happening. And even then, it can be pretty difficult because if you do things like play a 5 mana thing and you stole an Innervate, and then you cast the Innervate, the Shadow Reflection becomes the Innervate, not the 5 mana thing. So there's some weird wonkiness there. So I think probably 99% of the time, 5 mana is the hard cap for a Shadow Reflection, because as soon as you spend that 5 mana card and you use your Shadow Reflection, obviously there's no mana left. You can't Shadow Reflect a 6 mana card because that costs a total of 12 mana. So that's an interesting limitation on the Shadow Reflection. But as far as how that's practically used, so essentially, it's kind of a one-turn gamble sort of card. I don't think it's a long-term value card. It doesn't allow you to do things like cycle N'Zoths infinitely because you can't copy a N'Zoth. It leaves your hand at the end of the turn. So I don't think this will be about super long-term value plays. It could, right, where you just, you know, you continually create a second copy of a minion and you basically double the strength of your hand and you just always have double as many cards. Every card you draw could play multiples of if they cost less than 5 mana. But I don't really think that's the intent behind this design, and I don't think this would support that very well. I really think this is about opening up interesting combo opportunities. For instance, you can do things like I said, you know, the Leroy Eviscerate Eviscerate is an opportunity to do 14 damage with just 2 cards, which is pretty good. But if you dig into that and you run down that rabbit hole a little more, things like South Sea Deckhand, Cold Blood, Cold Blood, Cold Blood becomes an opportunity, right? Because you can only ever have 2 Cold Bloods before, but with Shadow Reflection you can have 3 Cold Bloods. And we've actually even seen that combo before in Rogue and in other classes. Well, not in other classes, but we've seen South Sea Deckhand used as combo charge activator in other classes. So suddenly you have a 14 damage South Sea Deckhand for only 4 mana, assuming you had the weapon active, which is pretty insane, right? Like, that's a huge South Sea Deckhand. And you can even use Faceless Manipulator on that, guys, because think about it. You're only spending 1 mana essentially on your shadow reflected Cold Blood. So you get South Sea Deckhand, Cold Blood, Cold Blood, Cold Blood, 14 damage South Sea Deckhand that gets Faceless Manipulated. That's a 28 damage combo in a single turn. And as long as you have 4 cards in hand, you'd need 2 Cold Bloods, a South Sea Deckhand, and your Faceless Manipulator. It's a 4-card combo. It's not a 5-card combo because the Shadow Reflection makes a copy. Then you could pull off a 28 damage combo fairly safely because you presume against a vast majority of matchups you're going to live for at least a turn when you move into that combo turn. You can do the same thing with Malygos, right? You can create an extra Razor Petal or Sinister Strike or whatever it might be. The mana gets a little wonkier there, right? Because you don't always have a ton of extra mana for Malygos combos. But if you have some cost reductions in play, maybe you're in Wild with Emperor Thaurissan, whatever the case might be, Shadow Reflections allows you to sneak out extra damage. So I think that's the utility for this card. So, I mean, unfortunately, it's probably a bit of a limited utility. I think this is a super cool design, very unique. Stealth hero for the first time ever, fits Valeera's lore perfectly. I like everything about this card from a fun standpoint. I don't think this at all fits into every Rogue deck. I think this is the kind of card you very specifically have to build around and work towards some sort of specific outcome with your Shadow Reflection. It's not going to pass back enough value on average on the average matchup. It seems like you absolutely need to have a specific game plan in mind, but within that context, it could fit really nicely and really empower some additional combos. Just being able to create an additional copy of a card is really cool and opens up design space that you've never had before in a deck when you're building that deck and building a game plan and building something to execute as far as a win condition. So Valeera the Hollow, cool fit for Rogue. Maybe not the strongest card on average every day, but still a card that seems like it'll be playable, seems like it'll carve out some kind of new combo potential for Rogue, which is, in my mind, a perfect new card for the class. And now we have Ultimate Infestation. I can hardly believe this card is real. If it weren't revealed by the mayor of Value Town himself, I don't know that I would be convinced it was real. This is Ultimate Infestation. It's a 10 mana spell for Druid. So another 10 mana spell. We really haven't seen very many of these in Hearthstone. But it certainly deserves every ounce of that mana cost and probably a lot more. Because with Ultimate Infestation, you deal 5 damage to any target. You draw 5 cards. That's a lot of cards. You gain 5 armor. Which, hey, that's a nice little bonus. And you summon a 5/5 ghoul. So basically all the 5s. Just give me every 5. Surprised it doesn't cost 5 mana, but of course that would be the best card in the history of the world. But even at 10 mana, this card's pretty absurd. If you start to do the math on each of those different things, 5 damage is probably 3 or 4 mana. Drawing 5 cards is probably 8+ mana. Gaining 5 armor is a mana, and the 5/5 ghouls like 4 or 5 mana. So it's something like 15+ total mana of value bundled into a single card. Not to mention the fact that when you tend to bundle things into a single card, they progressively cost more mana because there's value in only being for having all of those things in a single card. So any sort of like mana efficiency calculation here is absolutely off the charts. I mean, it's just silly that this only costs 10 mana. Now the question though is it good? Because sometimes, you know, even if there's a super efficient card, it's not necessarily good because it's slow or, you know, problematic for the class, whatever the case might be. And I actually think Ultimate Infestation is actually really, really good, not just really, really efficient. Essentially, right off the bat, if you look at this, you see Firelands Portal. Deal 5 damage and summon a 5/5. That's Firelands Portal's average result. And frankly, it's much more consistent than Firelands Portal, because sometimes Firelands Portal can low roll and give you smaller minions. Only very occasionally does it high roll into something great, but there's more risk in Firelands Portal. This is far more consistent. So even if this was like a 10 mana Firelands Portal, some classes would consider that okay. It'd be much worse than Firelands Portal, but it would be a card. The fact that you also get to draw 5 cards and there's a defensive element, I mean, it's absurd. 5 cards is an incredible amount of cards to get. Nourish for 5 mana only gives you 3, right? So you're getting a Firelands Portal plus a double Nourish, practically, as far as card draw is concerned. Like, I can't even calculate how just obscene that feels. But all that said, I don't actually think very many classes would be able to use Ultimate Infestation very well, because for 10 mana, at the end of the day, I don't know that this is a swingy enough card. It doesn't impact the board that much, right? It's Firelands Portal levels of swing, which can often be enough of a swing turn. So I actually think it does, but there is a small risk that it could be too slow because you're using your entire turn. Finding a window for this card could be difficult for some classes, but that's irrelevant because this is not a card for every class. This is a card for Druid, and Druid in particular is really, really good at ramping up to 10 mana or cheating out expensive cards earlier than normal. So there are going to be big ramp Druid decks, like there already are, that are moderately successful on the ladder, that run Ultimate Infestation with tons of success, because you'll basically be playing this card on turn 6, turn 7, turn 8. Rarely ever would you have to wait until you got a traditional 10 mana to play Ultimate Infestation. And even if this was something you top decked in the late game, it's got enough of a refill potential and enough of a swing potential on the board, not the biggest ever, but enough, that in that kind of deck that's, you know, that late into the game and already starting to stabilize, this is an absolutely fine play. But getting this out on turn 6 with a double Innervate is just totally absurd. Firelands Portal on 6 would already be overpowered. When you add the armor and the card draw on top of that, Ultimate Infestation's crazy. And people will play this on turn 6. They're going to have the, you know, the Nourish ramp, the Wild Growth starts, and it will absolutely be worth it to always ramp with Nourish if you have this card in hand, because you'll know you'll have an easy reload of 5 cards coming from Ultimate Infestation. So Nourish for ramp makes all the sense in the world, where sometimes it does already, sometimes it doesn't, but with Ultimate Infestation you don't have to rely on Nourish to refill your hand. So crazy potential here with Ultimate Infestation. I think it fits Druid really well. I even think it fits Jade Druids fairly well too, just because, you know, drawing all those Jades all at once as Jade Idols in the late game can be a big difference. It has some defensive potential, so I think any Druid that runs any kind of ramp that tends to go to control at all could fit a card like Ultimate Infestation really, really nicely. So this looks like the dream for Druid to me, for late game Druid, which is a dream for me personally, so I'm really excited. I don't know from a lore or theme standpoint if, you know, infesting with ghouls makes all that much sense for Druid, but I don't care. The card is brokenly, crazily good as far as bundling so many effects together, and I think it's fast enough for Druid specifically, and certainly a strong enough card to see lots and lots of play. I like this one a ton. So now let's move on to a new Warlock spell called Treachery. It's a new 3-mana spell that allows you to choose a friendly minion, and then your opponent gains control of the minion that you just chose. So on a surface level, without thinking about it too intricately, that sounds like a terrible play. Why would you want to give your opponent one of your own minions? You want your own minions. You want to have control of the board. And that's right. In an everyday use, this would be absolutely awful. But you can really quickly start to think of combo potentials with Treachery here, where you give your opponents really bad minions to have, and suddenly a little ding goes off in your hand and says, oh my god, Ticking Abomination, the card we saw at the very beginning of the Knights of the Frozen Throne card reveals part 2, that does, you know, a bunch of damage to your own side of the board, and everybody said that looks terrible. Hey, maybe with Treachery, that card makes a little bit more sense. Side note, it doesn't. It would still be terrible because that's a really, really expensive, inconsistent combo. So you might think that, but it's still terrible. But there are cards that do make sense with Treachery. Namely, the most obvious one is Doomsayer. With Treachery and Doomsayer, you can guarantee a board clear, much like Frost Nova Doomsayer, but it's absolutely guaranteed, and it's only a 5-mana combo, so it becomes sort of a really cheap Twisting Nether. Now, there are some downsides to that combo compared to Frost Nova Doomsayer. Essentially, when you Frost Nova Doomsayer, you also often cost your opponent an entire turn, where if they can't answer that Doomsayer, they're also not allowed to play anything else. So that has sort of a doubly advantageous tempo position. Whereas this one, you know, after you pull this off, your opponent, it goes back to their turn, and they can just reload the board. So this is not, arguably, in my opinion, nearly as strong as Frost Nova Doomsayer. It's much more problematic. It's good as sort of a last resort. If you're absolutely dead, it can buy you a little time, but isn't as strong of a tempo play as Frost Nova Doomsayer, which is really, really powerful when it works successfully. So that's the most obvious option for Treachery. There are a ton of other Warlock minions specifically that cause problems for your opponent, like Unlicensed Apothecary. People have tossed around Bittertide Hydra plus Spreading Madness. That's another terrible, terrible combo because it just costs way too much mana. It really wouldn't work very consistently at all and wouldn't do that much damage anyway. But there are some cards, right, that make sense. Warlock has cards that hurt you, that do bad things for you. So there is a very, very limited way to use this card. I really think the only way anyone will ever use it is with Doomsayer, and I'm not even sure that's that strong. So this feels like one of those cards, like thematically it's really cool for Warlock. I think it's awesome, but I don't think it's very good on average. I don't think there's going to be a lot of ways to use this. I don't think there's going to be many decks that want to use this, so this feels like one of those cards. Neat design, but very, very limited use cases. And there are going to be better options for those same use cases, so I don't really think Treachery is going to see very much play at all. So now let's move on to another 3-mana Warlock spell. This time it's called Unwilling Sacrifice, and with this one you choose a friendly minion, very similar so far, and then you destroy that minion, but you also destroy a random enemy minion. So essentially, this is Warlock's Deadly Shot, but with a slight downside in that you have to sacrifice something of your own. It's a bit like Shadow Flame as well, where you sacrifice your own minion to affect your opponent's board. But in both instances, both of those comparisons, I think Unwilling Sacrifice looks a lot worse to me, just because for mana efficiency, you know, Shadow Flame often you can clear an entire board. Unwilling Sacrifice, it's only a random minion, so it's, you know, unless they only have one minion and you use this as single target removal, doesn't feel that efficient. And you still have to sacrifice your own stuff, which, you know, compared to Deadly Shot has no downside of sacrificing your own stuff. So this feels worse than Deadly Shot. But of course, you know, that's a cross-class comparison, so that's fine. Classes don't have to have cards of equal power levels. And I think the idea here is to run this with cards that you don't mind killing. In other words, Death Rattle minions, right? If you're sacrificing Death Rattle minions, then this card makes you pretty happy. The most obvious choices for those are egg-style decks, right? So you can have a Devilsaur Egg, for instance, choose to destroy your Devilsaur Egg, and also simultaneously destroy a minion of your opponent's. And that feels like a much better play, because you're getting a 5/5 and destroying something on your opponent's side of the board. So yes, in an egg deck, whatever that might be, if it's Zoo, or maybe some other variation of egg, I can see this making sense. The question is, in that style of deck, is it a good card to include? Because, you know, if you don't have an egg on the board, suddenly this becomes either a dead card in your hand or a really risky card because it is rather conditional. So, you know, you have to have the mana to play an egg. You have to already have an egg on the board. You know, if you've already used your Ravenous Pterodax to kill the egg and you have to use this, you have to destroy an awesome Ravenous Pterodax or a 5/5 Devilsaur, that feels really bad. So, in other words, I'm afraid that running this in that kind of deck, in that environment, means that you just put yourself on too many awkward turns, where this just kind of sits in your hand and doesn't really do anything. Alternatively, in a lot of matchups, destroying a random enemy minion just isn't that powerful if they have 3 or 4 tokens out there. Destroying a random token isn't that good of a play. So, between the problems of using it yourself and the problems of actually getting it to hit a really relevant target, I worry that this one is just a little too awkward. I don't know that it's going to be easily utilized. From a raw power standpoint, it's okay. It's fine. Like I said, it makes sense in certain decks, in certain scenarios, but I think those scenarios aren't going to line up as nicely as people like to dream they will. So if you tried to build an egg Warlock deck around this, I think you'd fail more often than not, and you'd be able to build a better Warlock. Just traditionally, Zoo, Warlock, that kind of thing would work better for you than trying to slot in an awkward card like this. Because Zoo and those sort of, build upon your board style decks have never really needed a big single target removal card like this one. They kind of just ignore stuff or make really, really efficient minion trades into stuff. So I don't know that this card fits the bill, essentially, for Warlock. I mean, I think you'd rather use Blast Crystal Potion in a control deck, and I don't think you want to run this in a more minion-based deck. So this one just falls between the gaps. Not necessarily a terrible card, just a pretty terrible fit. And then finally we have the Brrloc, which I think might be the most creative combination of artwork and a pun for a name yet. And there's been a lot of good ones, but the Brrloc is awesome. So this is a Shaman card. It's a 2-mana 2/2 Murloc with a battle cry, freeze an enemy. So, I mean, the most obvious comparison to this card is Glacial Shard, the 1-mana 2/1 elemental. And if you do just a direct comparison, this one doesn't feel great because you only get 1 additional health for 1 mana, but that's okay. And it's hard to, when you're talking about small mana levels, mana costs for cards like this, and an effect like that that's that strong, it's kind of hard to give, Brrloc plus 2 health. It quickly kind of becomes too good. So even though 1 health for 1 mana doesn't sound great, this card in a vacuum actually probably feels okay because that's a strong effect attached to what is ultimately a reasonable body for a 2-mana minion. The problem, though, with Brrloc for me is simply that what Shaman deck cares that this is a Murloc that also wants to run freeze? I'm having trouble envisioning a Murloc freeze Shaman deck. We've clearly seen some freeze synergy added into Shaman, so that makes a little bit of sense if you just wanted to use this as a freeze card and the tribal affiliation is irrelevant. In that case, I feel like you might still just want to use Glacial Shard because it's so much more efficient, and the fact that the minion dies to pings probably isn't that relevant if you're playing a more late game strategy and you're looking for long-term value and that kind of stuff. You're probably okay to sacrifice a small minion to utilize the synergies of the freeze. So I feel like you'd probably just prefer the flexibility over Brrloc. If you're running a Murloc deck, is a freeze itself that strong? I mean, it could be, I suppose, if you went all in on Murlocs. That'd be fine. A Quest Murloc deck, I don't even know if they'd want to run this card necessarily, although it does kind of seem cool to stall out while you play your Megafin and refill your hand with Murlocs. Plus, of course, this would be a fine Murloc to get for free out of a Megafin to reload once you finish your quest as a Quest Shaman. So, it's a fine card. I think it's okay. I just don't think it's going to necessarily carve out a spot in any specific constructed list. Probably okay, might get tossed in here and there. It's fine that it exists. It's good for Murloc synergies. For whatever reason, Shaman keeps getting new Murloc synergy cards. Maybe there will be more Murloc freeze combinations in future expansions or something that open up the space for this one a little more. Right now, I think it's probably either a Murloc card or a freeze card, and never really both. So maybe it's a tad overcosted. I mean, honestly, I think you'd probably prefer to have a 1-mana 2/1 Murloc that's just a direct copy of Glacial Shard, because I think that'd be more flexible and give the Shaman more options to put it into more stuff. But as it stands, Brrloc is to me just fine. It's an average card that probably won't see a ton of play, but nonetheless isn't terribly bad or anything. And there you go, guys. That's it for my detailed reviews of those 5 cards. One standout card, and then a few fine cards beyond that. But what I'd like to do now is go through these cards really quickly and rate each of them from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and jump into that quick review process. I think Valeera the Hollow is a 3-star card. I think Ultimate Infestation is a 5-star card. I think Treachery is a 2-star card. I think Unwilling Sacrifice is another 2-star card. And I think Brrloc is finally another 2-star card. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for part 10 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. Not quite as many cards this time, but a little bit more stuff to digest. Some really interesting mechanics. Crazy spell for Druid, so I'm really curious what you guys have to say this time. Did I miss any fancy interactions? Did I miss some cool combos to discuss? Are these cards better than I thought on average? Is Infestation worse for some reason than I'm thinking? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.